Hi. Thank you for coming to Becoming Digital Age Storytellers, Questions and Strategies. I'm Amelia Wong. I'm the web content strategist at the J. Paul Getty Trust in Los Angeles. And I'm moderating today's discussion about navigating the challenges and discomfort that can arise when you take on the role of storyteller in a digital project. So I'm going to give a brief intro for some context. The panelists here are going to then give some intro on their projects and institutions. And then I'll ask them some questions to tease out some of the complexities of their projects in regards to storytelling, and especially if you're using digital media in that storytelling. And we'll leave some time for questions, as long as I watch the clock well. Twitter hashtag is MCN 2017 T39. All right. So a little context. Once upon a time, that would be about 3 years ago, there were a bunch of museum professionals, and they lived all over a large land. They worked for all different kinds of museums, but they were all submitting grants to the National Endowment for the Humanities that mentioned digital storytelling. Meanwhile, at the NEH, wise program officers were scratching their heads. What is this digital storytelling? And why is no one explaining what it is? Needless to say, nobody got any money from the NEH. But the NEH got an idea. They called the Tenement Museum in New York, and they asked them, would you organize a workshop for a bunch of museum professionals to get together and figure out what is digital storytelling? So they did. And a bunch of us gathered in New York for 3 days to talk about museums and digital storytelling. And we decided that, first, there's no such thing, of course. We're all using the term to refer to a bunch of different projects, different ideas. There's just a bunch of people using digital media to tell stories in new ways, sort of. But secondly, that museums engaging with storytelling as a tool, what did I write here? Lost my place. Museums engaging with storytelling as a mode of engagement and are using digital media to do so means addressing issues that arise in regards to these three things. The first being story, which of course is a buzzword, unfortunately, that we like to throw around a lot. But in this regard, I'm really talking about storytelling as a specific cognitive mode of engagement that links events together in cause and effect relationships, or that suggests cause and effect relationships between them. So it's not actually a story to say, I ate a sandwich, I got sick. This is just a list of potentially consecutive activities. It's a story, or at least the seed of a story, if you say, I ate a sandwich, later I got sick. Here you've begun to suggest that something happened because of something else. So this is the type of storytelling that we're interested in. And for museums, that means it's really important to understand how you're engaging with this concept to engage people. Thinking through the story you're trying to tell, the experience of that story that you're trying to deliver, and knowing if you're not actually telling a story, but if you're just trying to collect other people's stories. It's really important to know the difference. In terms of the other buckets, the other issues that arise concern, obviously, if you're using digital media, you've selected that as for a good reason to help you tell a certain story to a certain audience or to collect stories. A lot of questions arise to that. And then, of course, the particularities of your institution. So, in other words, at the end of this workshop, no surprise ending, we walked away with a lot more questions than answers, which is what brings us here. So I'm going to hand it over to the panelists to walk you through their institutions and projects, and then we'll start talking.
Can everyone hear me? My name is Abby Newkirk. I'm the Director of Interpretation and Education at Stratford Hall, and many of you may not have heard of it. It is a approximately 1,900-acre site in the northern neck of Virginia. That is the Potomac River in the distance and St. Mary's County, Maryland, and beyond that. It is the home of the Lees of Virginia, so 2 signers of the Declaration of Independence grew up there, but it is also the birthplace of Robert E. Lee, which you can imagine is a whole nother subject for another day. But this is the focus of my digital project. We've been working on adding a mobile tour inside the Great House so our visitors can explore the same spaces from different perspectives. We already have the Lee family perspective up, looking at it from the owner family. We have what's called the Lee Heritage Interpretive Plan, which has guided our interpretation, our stories, our collections, and our preservation projects for quite a long time, so we're well into that project. But the next perspective I'm working on is looking at the same spaces and the same issues from an enslaved perspective. So that means music, keeping family units together, resistance, grief and loss. And so we're working on building those stories. But unlike the Lee perspective, we don't have the stories yet. There's just not a lot of information. So where am I getting the information for my stories? Does anyone here interpret slavery? Oh, okay, well this is a probate inventory from 1782. It's one of our only complete records of the enslaved population at Stratford. I'm gonna step away from the mic for a second. This is a list of, this happens to be the men list. We have first names only, so tracking family units and descendants is extremely difficult. There are a few cases where we have had skills and for men only, which is, this case, there's Young, Rip, and Phil, and Frank are ship's carpenters, for example. Second, the next column over is their age, and the last column is their value in pounds. This isn't a story, this is facts. So how do I tell a story about them as individuals when that's the information I have? So I've gone to other places. There's the Geography of Slavery website, and I'll tweet it out and share it if anyone's interested, where you can do searches. And this summer I found the second entry down. I'm just going to read the first couple lines because it's a runaway slave ad. It says, ran away from subscriber on the night of the 5th instant. Harriet, a dark mulatto girl about 15 years of age, had on a deep blue cloth jacket and petticoat bound in red. She was bred at Stratford in Westmoreland County, to which a place it is probable she'll endeavor to make her way. And it goes on, and it was done by a woman named Ann Taylor. This is the start of a story. I have a name, I have an age, I have a date, I have a 15-year-old girl trying to get home, to the only home she knows. But Harriet doesn't show up in any of our records, so I was trying to figure out why that could be. Luckily, we have an entry from Richard Henry Lee's memorandum book a few years earlier that has the name Taylor in it. So we find out that the Lees had a kind of a deal with the Taylor family in Fredericksburg of either leasing or lending out enslaved girls to work at their home. We have 2 cases of it. So we start to get, between these 2 entries, I know approximately a journey. Well, if the first one is a girl named Grace, I know how she got to Fredericksburg. Odds are Harriet took a similar journey. So this is where I'm starting to actually get a story. I can't tell Harriet's entire life, but I can tell a really compelling story for a piece of it. And just the idea of a 15-year-old girl who is biracial, but dark skinned, so she's not gonna pass for white, taking according to Google Maps today, a 14-hour walk to get from Fredericksburg back to Stratford. And it's just, I think, I'm very excited to tell her story. She doesn't have any descendants that are advocating for her. We're the only ones. This one newspaper article on October 22nd, 1789 is the only evidence she ever existed on this planet. And so telling these stories, but it's very difficult when you have to kind of mine very small details from a lot of places. And that's been an area I've had to, as a storyteller, get comfortable, is crafting these stories from these sources. You okay?
Perfect. I'm actually going to sit here and give my presentation, or my 5 minutes. So, can you advance the slide for me, Amelia?
Yes.
Okay, I only have 1 slide, so another reason why I can sit here. Okay, Hi, my name is Kristin Bayans, and I am the manager of interpretive media at the Portland Art Museum in Portland, Oregon. And the Portland Art Museum is a mid-sized institution. We mostly focus on individuals who are in the Pacific Northwest and within the Portland metropolitan area. So that's mainly our audience. The project I'm going to talk to you about today is Object Stories. I did not originate this project. This project started about 7 years ago, and I've been with the project for 4 years. The project is a local, when I say local, I mean Portland, Pacific Northwest, personal storytelling project and exhibition series. I view this project as a living document of the city over time. The way in which I've approached this project always changes, so it's never something that stays the same way for very long. And I've grown this project into, I should say because I'm a team of one, but I now have a little bit more help. So we, as an institution, have grown this project into a way for Portland's many communities, and communities are broadly defined, where these communities can directly address issues affecting their lives. So when I say that, I mean we had an exhibition on LGBTQ individuals. It was an intergenerational exhibition. We paired folks together. They had a conversation about what it's like to live out your life in Portland at this point in time, and then also what it was like to live out your life in Portland many years ago from a specific perspective. We have about 4 exhibitions a year, and the exhibitions are all thematic, and the themes are chosen for their relevance to what's going on in our city. Let's see. The original goals for the project were to deepen participation with the museum through conversation and personal storytelling, and to move from the single authoritative voice of the museum to many voices. The challenges that I'm facing right now are getting participants to be comfortable with the role of storyteller, getting them to self-identify as storytellers and sitting in their power as storytellers. Also, not everyone at my museum is ready for these types of stories to be told. And specifically these types of stories to be told in a museum setting. An art museum setting, I should underscore the word art museum. So basically, not all of our house is in order, but this gallery is pushing change at a rapid pace. So I'm very excited about that. As we all know, museums are very slow moving ships. This project is helping to give a little bit more steam to our ship, a little bit faster. And I'm also having an issue with extending the stories outside of the gallery. So the stories are presented on iPads within the gallery space, and there are about between 5 and 6 stories for each exhibition. And the stories exist outside of that space as story bites on social media. So I tweet out portions of the stories throughout the run of the exhibition. They also live on YouTube, and so I'm really wanting to extend their life on YouTube, and I'm looking right now at 2 ways in which to do that. 60-second documentary and The Great Big Story are similar to Object Stories, and so I'm wanting to investigate more as to how they're doing their projects. But so those are my main challenges right now.
Can you hear me? Okay, I think that's on. I'm Silvina Fernandez-Duque. I work at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. I'm part of a group called Future Projects, and we basically research and test and prototype different technologies, some old, some new, to try to figure out new ways to tell our stories and reach new audiences. And one of the things that we've been thinking about recently are games, and if that could be a tool to reach new folks and tell our stories in new ways. So obviously Holocaust games, not an easy combination, but games have been in the learning environment for a long time. You know, there's research out there, they're effective. This is not new. So, you know, it was a challenge for us to figure out, are there games that can help us teach about the Holocaust? One of our core constituencies are students. About a quarter of our museum visitors are school-age children. A large proportion of our web visitors are students and educators. So this is a big audience for us. So could we use games to reach students? And to make this history really relevant for them. Students now think of World War II as ancient history. So how do we make this relevant in ways that they can understand and speak to them? So this is an image of a student in our permanent exhibition. For those of you who have not visited, permanent exhibition is a linear exhibition that takes you in a chronological path from 1933 to 1945. It's a pretty demanding experience. It can be pretty exhausting. So we were trying to think of tools maybe to help prep students for their visit, or perhaps something that they could do after their visit. We had the opportunity to work with the Parsons School of Design and a group of graduate students on designing a game, or coming up with ideas for games. So we worked with their PET lab, which is Prototyping Education and Technology Lab. So 2 of their professors and a group of 15 grad students came down to the museum for a weekend, and they kind of immersed themselves in our culture, tried to learn what we're all about, our challenges, and then they went back up to New York, and by the end of the week they had come up with 6 paper prototypes of game ideas for us to play test. One of them was a texting app called Joined. This is the paper prototype. It's a brilliant play test, I have to say. It was theatrical. They had it orchestrated brilliantly. It was a lot of fun. And basically, the premise of this of the game is it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. So you receive a lot of texts, and then you have to make a choice and respond, and you have to decide what you're going to do. So the story is that you play a character in this initial prototype that they built. You play a character named Paul, and you have a friend whose name is Alex, and Alex has a curfew, and he has to make it home by a certain time. And your phone is blowing up with text. You've got text from your mom, your dad, your friends, from Alex. You have to figure out what you're going to do. There's a group that wants to get Alex in trouble. What do you do? So you go through the experience, and then at the end, you watch a video of a survivor testimony that inspired the scenario that you've just played through. So this is a screenshot of kind of some of how the app lays out in the digital version. So we now have a digital version of this. We've been testing it with students, teachers, staff, to see if there's potential to move this forward to another stage of development. The story is crucial. Like the digital component is really important, building the back end and all of that, making sure it's seamless. But if the characters don't ring true, if the storyline doesn't make sense, the whole thing just totally falls apart. So if this were to move forward, the scripting would be an essential part of this project. And I will leave it there.
Oh, this is like my height. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Chelsea Bracci, and I am the Education Associate for Digital Media and Programs at the Tenement Museum. So kind of going back to where we started, I think the thing I've heard the most this last few days is that everybody knows who the Tenement Museum is, but man, they wish they'd gotten to visit it. So just wanted to quickly kind of explain our model and who we are. The Tenement Museum is a museum that's grounded in storytelling and is grounded in kind of celebrating and enhancing the story of immigration within the United States community, and kind of celebrating and putting those stories out there, and doing that through storytelling. if you haven't been inside our museum, this is what it looks like. We like to say it's in a preserved state of decay, but there's also recreated apartments. This is the Baldizzi apartment. This is not a museum that you are allowed to wander through or experience on your own. It is through a guided experience where our educators, who are researchers in and of their own, tell you the story of families that lived in this building, including the Baldizzis. It was a residence from 1863 to 1935. Nearly 7,000 people lived in our historic building of 97 Orchard Street during that time. But we're actually kind of expanding, literally, our exhibition space into new buildings and kind of bringing the timeline up into the present as well. And so the Tenement Museum is not the museum I was a part of for the conference experience that we're talking about. I was a participant within the conference and represented the Maryland Historical Society. So pretty different looking, much more of a traditional museum space. And it's meant to represent the stories of all Marylanders. And something that the museum then and continue, and I think a lot of museums struggle with, is fully embracing and celebrating the diversity that is the stories of Marylanders. So I was a grad student and therefore dreamed big and was like, what if we create this platform where people can contribute stories about their community, so we could tell the history of Maryland by Marylanders in the exhibit space, elevate them to the story of curator, and let's do it in all our galleries. So they said, cool, try it. And I was like, great, let's do it. And I was like, I don't fully know how to do this. And it's when I saw the announcement for this workshop, and I realized that this was a chance to work with 20 other people, go to the Tenement Museum, the museum that I knew of as the storytelling institution, and had my museum crush on, and to get to really workshop and figure out, how do you do this? How do you storytell in a digital way and make it meaningful in a way that people connect to? Which I feel like is probably a reason why a lot of people are here, is because that question is huge and we're all still wrestling with it. So I got very lucky that I got to participate in this network, and it revolutionized the way I think about storytelling, digital, what is the role of a museum in a community, and I made some really meaningful connections with people, and now I work at the Tenement Museum. And I am still in awe of of the way that all of these projects are grounded in storytelling, and digital is then used as the tool to enhance and elevate story. So I just wanted to quickly show, Amelia talked about the categories of storytelling, and there was that kind of first category of story as structure. And there are those spaces within the physical museum that visitors are engaging with through these kind of guided experiences, through the new building on the left. If you get to come and experience the new Under One Roof tour. And then on the right, through Shop Life, which is in that basement of 97 Orchard Street, using technology to elevate story. But then there is this kind of new, and I would say like kind of first time that the museum is offering itself up as a platform in a digital way to collect the stories of everyone. Everyday, ordinary people, and what are their families' experiences of immigration and migration here within the United States. So this is your story, our story. It is a platform for collecting the stories of just that immigration and migration, broadening the story outside of our buildings, New York City, and really kind of bringing everyone into the story and elevating everyone to the role of storyteller. Everyone contributes an object story, so they pick an object, they write a story, they can submit audio. And now the challenges we're kind of wrestling with are in many ways the same challenges I faced at the Historical Society, because it's a platform. How do we scaffold this experience? How do we empower people who we may never ever get to see in person to be successful storytellers and tell good stories and use good storytelling tactics? But where do we also go? That's kind of the fun thing with the relaunching of this site. This is kind of a sneak peek at the new version. Kat sent it to me. And we are now weaving these stories together that people are submitting into our own narratives and using them as a basis for our storytelling, and incorporating them into other buildings. So it's kind of the challenge of where do we go from here now that we've created this platform, and how do we do these stories justice as well? So those are some of the things that we're struggling with.
Thanks, everybody, for those intros. So clearly more questions than answers. I didn't say this in the intro, but we actually had 2 workshops. The original one was really kind of about the concept of digital storytelling, which once you pull it apart, you don't have much left except for the questions that really are around how to use storytelling as an engagement and technique that involves a lot of personal and emotional kind of events that are linked together in a way that suggests kind of larger meanings than the events themselves. And these create all sorts of ethical and technical and logistical problems, as I think was alluded to in all of the presentations. So we're going to start with, I'm going to turn it back to the panelists to kind of flesh out some of those issues, especially starting with the representation of people in stories, and then talking a bit about like how do you help people represent themselves in stories? What are your responsibilities to both of those? So you'll have noticed from the projects that they're different. Abby's and Silvina's are more within this kind of like actually storytelling experience where they're using a story as a structure for an experience, and quite different from, even though Chelsea's work now is more in that camp, it's the project she was talking about as well as the other Tenement Museum project, and what Kristen were talking about are more about collecting stories. So this first question then I'll let Silvina and Abby field in terms of how you're addressing the responsibilities you have to the people or person you're representing in your story, especially since you've never met them.
I just was wondering, do we want to put the last slide with our Twitter handles up? 'Cause
Oh,
I
yeah.
think some people couldn't, in case, yeah. Yeah. Let me start. Okay. Go for it. I got it. There's been warnings that we have to talk into the mic, so I'll move it. Yeah, there's a lot of responsibility, especially at sites like us interpreting slavery. It's a big topic now that gets a lot of attention. And lately I've been very aware of how stories can also be weaponized and used. An example I'll give is we have our only descendant family we know about is the Payne family, and we know that they're here during the with the later owners, but their oral history goes back all the way to the time of the Lees. There were 3 owners between it being a Lee property and it being a museum. And after the Civil War, Bill Payne, who was born into slavery, returned. So you can imagine how that sounds, they weren't bad. They were not bad slave owners because he came back. It couldn't have been that bad. What people forget is it's the only home he ever knew. His wife and family was still there. Burial plot was there. So that's an example of how historically that's been used to kind of spread the happy slave narrative. And I'm very aware of that and the responsibility I have to his descendants that we're still very close to. The family has been involved with us throughout. They were early interpreters at the museum. And so I have to take not only adding these new stories that I'm researching, like Harriet and Grace and all these new perspectives I'm adding, but also making sure that I'm being very responsible in the information I put out so it can't be used by anyone with an agenda, which I think some of our stories have been. I'm also my job before Stratford was at a women's history museum, and women's stories are often omitted, so I'm being very aware of balancing, making sure we don't ignore the women's stories just because there's more records about the men. I have to fight a little bit more, but making sure we have balance so that all voices are heard. And so there's not a lot of people in the enslaved perspective, like descendants or family members, that I can talk to because there's no record, but with the exception of the Payne family. But it's a responsibility that those of us on staff are really taking very seriously and making sure we do the work and put a lot of work in it. It goes slow, not as fast as I want it to be, but in the end, I'm more confident that we'll be proud of the final product.
So part of the title of the museum is Memorial Museum, and we take that very seriously. When we tell the stories of victims, we don't ever want to trivialize or exploit those stories, and we try to, respect their experiences. And we also realize that it's important to tell individual stories, and sometimes that one story will represent, millions of lives that were lost. So, there's sometimes when someone really connects with an individual story, that's really powerful, but it also sometimes stands in for many other individuals. And when we tell our stories, we want to be as accurate as possible. And a lot of times, it works best when we have documentation and evidence to support that story. So, one of the things that they did when they designed the texting app was to include the testimony so that that this happened to somebody, that that it's not a composite or fictionalized figure. The experience is sort of contemporized, but it comes from something that actually happened.
So kind of taking the other side of this in regards to the responsibilities you have to the people who you do meet, whose stories you're sharing. Chelsea and Kristen, why don't you?
Let's see, can I talk from here? Oh, I'll just talk loud. So something I kind of had an aha moment about at the first conference, and I think it's been really interesting to see and kind of come into the process of the Tenement Museum scaffolding this experience, is that we have a responsibility to these people who are contributing their voice. That storytelling, whether it's on a digital platform or it's a novel or it's in print, is very personal and can be very intimate. And we are asking people to put themselves out there in a way that media can be consumed, and they might not have the ability to respond, and it might get taken off and put in a whole nother direction. So for me, going into it the first time, I was very concerned about what am I asking people to do, and how do I make sure that, sure, my project's successful, but how do I set up every single participant for success in providing this platform for them? And it's been very kind of enlightening to go through it with the Tenement Museum and see kind of how much working with people and taking that process slowly has been important. So that way, when you get to the point that you're launching this and that millions of people may interact with this site, and you may never actually get to talk to them and walk them through the process the way you maybe wish you could, to make sure that they're also being successful and that you're kind of maintaining that success throughout all of it, and that nobody walks away from this feeling that maybe their story is being put out in a way that they don't appreciate. But it's also the thing that we've gotten emails where people have been like, I didn't realize how internet this was. Like, I didn't realize it was actually out there. And so we take it back. We can take it down. And I think that conversation is almost just as important as those conversations where people love that it's out. So being willing to kind of have those dialogues, I think, has been one of the most important and enlightening things as well for me.
All right, so I just want to preface this by saying that my goal for Object Stories is to make sure that I don't have a job. I want to make sure that the space turns into a completely community-driven space within the museum. Object Stories is literally at the transect of both of our museum buildings. So you have to go through that gallery space in order to get to modern and contemporary art and all that kind of stuff. So it has a very prominent space within the within the museum. So to answer the question, I ensure as much as I possibly can that their voice is apparent in the whole entire process. So the new things that I have been doing in the past 4 years, I'm not an expert on everything. I am the first person to admit that. So what I've been doing is embedding myself within the community, gathering up roundtables of individuals who know more about certain subjects than I do, making sure that if I'm having an exhibition on the refugee community, that refugees are at the table to have that conversation, to understand how to ask the questions and what questions are important to ask. So community roundtables, that's before the exhibition even launches. Started developing a storytelling and exhibition development workshop with our participants. So I'm now working, actually a participant from a past Object Stories is helping to run the storytelling workshops with me. So that's something new that we're doing. We're gonna do it from beginning to end, actually, for the first time for the next rotation. Also changing the way we interview people. So before with object stories. I didn't get into this part, but there's a whole past experience of object stories where individuals went into a storytelling booth and talked to a machine. So with prompts that were predetermined. Now I'm able to talk to people one-on-one. It's a more personalized experience. It's person to person, not person to machine. And I do my homework on these people. And as a reminder, these people are just like you and me. Like, they're not professional storytellers. And so I tailor the questions to them and also to the theme. I interview and I edit the audio, but I ensure that throughout that process, that whatever I have edited is okay with the storytellers. I have several chances, opportunities for individuals to tell me, hey man, that sucked. You know, that is definitely not what I said. Luckily, that hasn't happened yet. So they can shape the outcome of their story. I also, and this is my favorite part, they co-create everything with me. And they help to write the introductory text to the gallery. They help write and inform the label text that goes on every single object in the gallery. And they also ideate and right now, while I was gone, this actually happened, install a participatory space. So another whole other part of object stories is a participatory space that underscores the big idea of whatever that exhibition is about. So those are just some of the ways in which I can address that question.
So that's, right now we are addressing what responsibilities you have to the people whose stories you are telling or sharing with the world. But there's another responsibility, obviously, to your audience. We talk about stories a lot in museums in very vague ways, without attending, I think, overly well to the fact it's actually a really manipulative rhetorical technique. The danger with storytelling is that it can be so good that people are convinced that they've heard the whole story, when in fact the power of storytelling, I think this is why people do get interested in it with museums, is that good storytelling actually provokes questions. In setting up links between events, suggestive links that makes your imagination kind of like start to ask questions, start to ask where the links are. So in that sense, what is intriguing about digital for storytelling is that supposedly, we could talk about this later if you're interested more, but that you can make non-linear, big quotes here that I'm using, non-linear stories that give more of the power to the audience to kind of control their experience. It's really problematic. But I want to turn it back to the panelists to talk about kind of how you're handling the responsibilities you have to your audience in terms of how you're telling these stories, using the power of storytelling to engage them but not mislead, and maybe where digital fits into that as well. Can collapse those questions together.
So in the texting experience that was designed, one of the ideas, so in answering sort of this question of how do you maybe not leave them thinking that this was, you know, the one experience, one of the ideas was to be able to play the same story through the eyes, playing different characters, so you get to see one situation for multiple perspectives, and hopefully that would, you know, lead to sort of more questions and understanding of the complexity of the situations and the challenges. And also this experience was designed to be a facilitated experience. The idea was that this would be targeted to students and their teachers, and so they'd have an experience together, but then they'd be able to talk about it afterwards and get more context.
One of the things that came out of the workshop for me, which someone that's not here at the conference, it's kind of jumped out to him and he brought it to my attention, is one of my big fears of creating multiple narratives, which digital tool gives an opportunity do so much more and have options, but it also gives people the opportunity to opt out of certain narratives that they're uncomfortable with. So do I really want someone to come to Stratford, take the tour, and only take the Lee perspective that is much more positive about the slaveholders and not see anything about the lives of the enslaved? So that's one thing I'm struggling with. I don't quite have an answer on how I want to make sure that everyone leaves with the information of what slavery really was like at Stratford. And then there was actually a comment on Twitter talking about how do you deal with creating the story when you don't have all the information. And that's something that, you know, I was like, how can I write a story if I don't have all the facts? And this woman named Joby Hill that has a project called Saving Slave Houses. So she's documenting slave structures. She was at Stratford doing some research, and she looks at me, she's like, what's wrong with you? She's like, we've been doing third-hand accounts for white people all the time, and we accept it as facts. Why aren't you willing to take second, third kind of information to craft a story? We're just a lot more comfortable with our Lee family stories because they're so well established, all these facts. You have to make the jump. And so I've been working on, when I do make a jump, how can I communicate that to the public so they have an understanding of what we know and what is maybe a composite or pulling information of this. We don't have an account of what Harriet felt like, but I have this account of what the feelings and the emotions of another enslaved and where we're pulling it. So how can I tell the story but also communicate how the story came together and what information we're using? And so those are some of the making sure people can't bypass the narrative, and also educating where the information's coming from is two things I'm really working on right now.
I guess, yeah. So for object stories, it's in the title, stories, not story. So that's one way of signing that there are multiple perspectives. With object stories also, I try as hard as I can to ensure that the storytellers are as intersectional as possible. The storytellers' faces are in the space, as are their names. I'm gonna skip that part. Also, we do pop-up programming in the space outside of other participatory activities. A good example of that would be for a particular exhibition, we brought in the Multnomah County Library, and they ran a mobile library unit with books and multimedia offerings that people could check out based on the subject of the exhibition. We had a reading list, a bookmark that went with the exhibition. Those went like hotcakes. Also with that, people could actually get a library card and check out those materials on site. Also on the website, it's very explicit how the project works. I am working on a way in which to tell that aspect of the project, that aspect of the project in the space itself, because obviously not everyone online is going to see what's going on in the gallery and vice versa. Outside of the naming of the individuals who are working on the project, it's known that the education department is working on the project as well. So trying to be as explicit as possible in as many ways as possible are how we tackle that question.
And I guess I'll just add really quickly. Someone said this in a session before, and they said the audience is the client. And while it seems super simple, this idea that we don't get to start maybe where we think, I want to do a digital project using this technology. It's about meeting them where they are and what are their needs and what are their expectations. And we might think a certain platform's really shiny and cool, but if it's not gonna, if those superpowers of that platform, and we talk about digital superpowers, I swear I'm not making this up, if the superpowers of that platform don't really fit exactly what you're trying to do for that audience in that moment, then you're failing your client. And that's when we get apps that nobody uses or doesn't actually help anyone get to the bathroom, or we fail, right? So I think the idea of always going back to that audience, and it's something that I've seen in the creation of this Your Story, Our Story platform, is the amount of time that is spent talking to people and about their feelings about what we're doing. And that takes a lot of guts, I think sometimes. I know sometimes I don't want to show people stuff until it's good and ready. But the idea of keeping the community, keeping your audience and the client throughout the entire process, the central key piece, it seems simple, but I feel like there's so many times where we miss the mark. And I know I've missed the mark in my past, too.
So I have one final question for the group before we're going to answer it, open it for questions since it's already almost 5. And that question is about the panelists giving you kind of a resource that they have found really useful for getting more comfortable kind of claiming the role of storyteller. Storyteller, and it kind of exists sort of like artist in museum practice, is this sort of like genius, kind of natural talent category where either you're born with it or you're not. If maybe you identify as a really good storyteller, maybe you feel much more capable in that role in your job, but maybe you don't. And actually, like creativity and talent, storytelling is a skill that you can cultivate over time, mostly through, I think, just a lot of practice and willing to fail or improve. But so, Silvina, will you start, share one thing that you've learned or a resource that you found is really helpful in this regard?
So another part of my life involves watching documentaries. I am a volunteer on a screening committee for a documentary film festival. And documentaries, especially observational documentaries, have been extremely instructive in learning how to structure a story, because you capture a lot of footage, you have the messiness of life, and you may have an idea of where your story is going, but you don't really know what's going to happen the next day. You may miss a day of filming where something amazing happened. So how do you tell that story in a narrative that makes sense? So I recommend watching documentaries, and I'm just going to make a plug for 2 that came out this year that I think are excellent. One is called Quest. It's a film by Jonathan Olszewski. He followed a family in Philadelphia over the course of 10 years, basically during the Obama presidency. It's a beautiful, beautiful film, beautifully crafted, beautifully photographed. Another one is The Force by Peter Nix, and he followed over 2 years the Oakland Police Department, and that's another beautifully crafted film. I recommend both.
One of Amelia's suggestions on how to become a better storyteller, she's like, just consume more stories to learn. And so I listen to podcasts all the time now, and it's gonna sound kind of random, but does anyone ever listen to It's Been a Minute on NPR? I really like it, but there's a section at the end where people all week call in and leave a voice recording of the best thing about their week. And it's people celebrating their kids riding their bike, or this mother, her son hadn't had a seizure in 2 weeks, and that was the best part. One girl just was walking home and got free breadsticks. So it's really kind of random, but I cry every time. It's like, everyone jokes about it, but you cry because it's people sharing becoming a citizen, and people are emotional in the recordings, and you just realize the powerful of someone telling their story. And so it's kind of random, but every Friday I'm in the car and I'm like just waiting for the best part of my week, because it's hearing a personal story in their own voice. It's real, and I really want to know who this woman is, and I want to know how her son's doing now. And I'm invested in these people's lives for these brief little recordings, and so that's kind of really understanding. And so I could list a ton of podcasts, but that one thing is something I look forward to. It makes me feel good because it's good things in the world, but also just the power of a story.
So I'll give you a resource, but I also wanted to say one more thing. Another lesson learned that I learned along the way is that make sure that you can find ways to continue and extend your partnerships, because they are an invaluable resource to you. And the storytellers themselves. The storytellers are being woven into actually I say this backwards. The museum is now being woven into the fabric of the city, instead of the other way around, which I was going to say in a second. Okay, so the resource that I wanted to plug is a podcast, and it's called How Sound, HOWSOUND, and it's on transom.org. Transom is TRANSOM. And it is a bi-weekly podcast. It's all about storytelling, and it's led by Rob Rosenthal. And it takes you through the mechanics of storytelling. How do you tell a good story? What is a good story? How do you create a story world? How do you insert facts into your story? So there's all kinds of topics that are covered, and it's been great to listen to over the past year, and it's definitely improved my practice.
Perfect. I'm going to quickly jump up and show you the resource. So one of the key things for us, let's see. Did I do it right?
It should be somewhere in there. No, it's towards the end.
It's towards the end.
Sorry. This is
Oh, we're all gluten-free.
Yeah, this is
we're the gluten-free
this is all
panel. Is the most important resource for me coming out of this conference was the people I met and the people I can now contact and say, like, hey, I'm struggling with this. What are your thoughts? And I think that's something I've heard coming out of every single session is these conversations are so helpful, that this conference is so helpful because we get to have these conversations. So the resource I'm trying to share with everyone is let's create a network. The workshop created a network of 20 people who continue to meet up and respond. We had a reunion, but we want to expand that to anyone who wants to participate and share their experience as a digital age storyteller. So the Tenement Museum has created a toolkit where you can learn, I should know how to work a Mac, you can learn about the conference, about the workshop, but we've also now started sharing the resources from the workshop and the reunion in a toolkit. So if you want to listen to Amelia talk a lot more about anecdote versus story and digital projects, what is digital storytelling versus digital age storytelling? What is media convergence? And learn more about what were some of those discussions that we had, like from Ed, I don't think he's in the room right now, join to really see what happened within the reunion and within this conference, but then join the network as well. One of the biggest kind of resources that we took out of it was the creators created this digital storytelling grid, which maps the digital age the digital storytelling superpowers of the technology. So immersive, multiple perspectives, telling complex stories, moving from listener to participant. And they broke us down into those three main tactic groups of structure, technique, platform, and they put us on a grid and said, talk to the people in your spot, in that grid spot with you. So join the grid. There is a form on this website, and I have the link up here for you to submit your project and submit yourself to join this network. And the hope is that next time when you're trying to figure out, I want to create a platform, and I really kind of want to include multiple voices, and look, these people are kind of doing this as well. Let me reach out to them and talk to them about the challenges. What technology, what partners did they reach out to? So this is my shameless plug for a resource that I hope you all will join. I have little pieces of paper, and I'll tweet it out as well. But join the DS Muse network. Let's continue these conversations in a real, meaningful way that's grounded in storytelling.
Well, I want to thank the panel. And I want to say, this is why like linking things together is hard in a story and also in a conference presentation. I mentioned earlier there were 2 workshops, and I never actually finished with an explanation of what the second one was. We had our first one talk about definitions, concepts, story elements, and then the second one was about tactics, like how do you actually put those in play? And that was a reunion workshop that we had at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And that's where this actually, these more practical resources have come out of. So I hope you'll join and help us keep the conversation, the questions going, and maybe get to some answers or just solutions. Anyway, I'll open up to questions now. Any questions from the audience?
So in either the planning for these projects or the evaluation after, how does the scale or the size of your digital audience factor into it? And what are how much does that factor into, do you care, and especially with the specifics of the sensitivities that you talked about, how does that factor into how willing and how interested you are in sort of how broad an audience, an online audience you want to see these projects?
Mine's not online.
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but I'll address it, I think, maybe. So I think the digital factor for us was one, using a digital technology that our target audience was familiar with and you know, would be comfortable with. So texting was a language that they spoke, right? So that's where they are. So you know, there was no learning involved in how to use the experience. And then the other positive of digital is that the distribution becomes that much easier. We are still in prototype and testing phase. We have no idea where this particular project is going to go, so I have no idea. But you know, one of the other prototypes that came out of the design jam was a paper board, like a regular board game. So that's, you know, it's physical. It's a physical object. There's nothing digital. The distribution of that is a whole other beast. And so, you know, it's something that we would love to see out in the world too. Like something physical is different these days, but yeah, distributing it and all of that is something else. So digital makes some things easier and maybe some things harder.
Kristen, I wonder if you want to field that in relation to I mean, you have personal stories and
Right.
you guys put them online in various ways.
So our storytellers know where the stories are going, and also that's actually, I mean, like, how to distribute what is on YouTube in a better way is a goal of mine. I want to figure that out. I would like for it to go as far as it can possibly go, but like, I would within that, I want to make sure that people within our city know that this project exists. So being able to make it go viral as much as I possibly can within our own city via digital would be the goal for me.
And I think for us too, I think it does play a big role. I mean, for us, every tour is capped at like 15 people. We sell out almost every day. That's a lot of people who don't physically get to come and visit the museum. So for us, we are looking at those numbers, and that is a huge consideration. And I think it's also a huge piece of why this project, and I'm joining it later, but why this kind of project came to be as well, is that we're telling a national narrative in New York City, and so that was a big piece of it, was looking at those numbers and reaching different audiences across the country as well, especially with teachers and schools. That's been a huge audience, and working with partner institutions. So taking it one step further, MIA is a partner for us who will have their own piece of YSOS, or Your Story, Our Story, where they have their own page. People can contribute stories through them. So those numbers as well. I mean, so yes, numbers matter in that way, but it's also for us, it was reaching the national audience and just period, because that is kind of a new step.
I'll just explain. Mine's not online, but ours is very mission driven. We are not currently telling a story we need to be telling and finding ways that we can tell that story. So while I want lots of people to use it, absolutely, the fact that I'm getting these stories out to our visitors is my primary motivation. And fingers crossed, I get a lot of people listening, but I will take, you know, the more people that listen, the better. So.
Yeah, I had a question about your original information about the fact that you each didn't think that there was any such thing as digital storytelling. Because I'm kind of new to the museum world, and I've taught digital storytelling on the university level, and I came out of a tradition. There is a book called Digital Storytelling. You're probably familiar with it. And so that there is a form of digital storytelling that's incredibly effective, actually. I taught students for years where they came up with their own stories, which I can understand is sort of different probably than what happens in museums, where you have to partner with people to create exhibits and work with them to tell their stories. But I guess because I found that it was such an incredible experience, really, to work with people and to facilitate their digital storytelling. It makes me sad to think that that's not being considered a real thing, because in fact there is a real thing.
Well, yeah, so I think you're referring specifically to the Center for Digital Storytelling, right? So is there anyone familiar with Center? Okay, so digital storytelling is actually, it's a term that's been encoded in a certain way in a tradition of video, personal storytelling. This was a nonprofit actually started by a theater director, and I think maybe both of them were theater directors. But this was like early, like when prosumer consumer like video cameras were coming out, as well as like early 90s. This nonprofit formed to help people learn how to use this technology to tell their own stories. And so initially, it's a workshop-driven process. I've done it. It's 3 days. It's very intense, incredibly rewarding, and actually quite like workshops go, where you're like living with 3 people or a bunch of people for 3 days sharing personal stuff, because you're always telling a personal story, your voice with imagery from your life, and trying to link it together in a structure that speaks to this larger meaning about why it's meaningful to you. And the only way to do that is to workshop it. Because sometimes you come with an anecdote that you know is important to you, but you don't know why. And talking through it with other people helps you figure out like how to craft it into a narrative that will speak to other people about kind of your point and help that resonate. But it's interesting. So I think the NEH, I wouldn't say that they didn't know about that, but what they were seeing within their applications is that this term was being used to describe like a ton of different stuff. And it's interesting is that in the last 2 years, the Center for Digital Storytelling actually renamed itself Story Center, because the founders recognized like the digital is just a tool for their particular form of storytelling, and they really wanted to focus it on the story. But I think what's interesting about that model is that the workshop is very intense, and I think it speaks to what comes out of there is often like really lovely, like 3 to 5 minute videos, which are just photos with a voiceover overlaid. But to get something of that quality took 3 full days of work. And sometimes, like, especially in museum projects where we're asking people to tell meaningful stories, but what you end up getting a lot of times is like anecdotes that are maybe kind of funny or interesting, but not maybe what you were looking for in terms of fitting the theme or goal of your project. And sometimes that's because they're lacking this kind of like finding out why is that anecdote like important to me? And you sometimes don't get there if you don't have like a really deep conversation about it.
Right. I mean, I did it over a semester with students, and actually what I did was I integrated the documentary process, the documentary creation process with the digital storytelling. And it is just remarkable, it can be a remarkable document of personal stories that people create for themselves that they often don't want to share with anybody besides the class.
And that's a good place to end in terms of the Story Center, as it's called now, storycenter.org. It's a great resource if you're kind of interested in kind of digging into the storytelling process, a traditional storytelling process. Their workshops are offered all over the country, but they also do webinars and different things, so you can check them out for examples. But thank you all for coming. And one more round of applause.
Thank you.